essay about postmodernism. And I should mention that I'll be keeping that term in scare quotes because I happen to disagree with these arguments. To begin, I've organised a paper around the theme of the open society, derived of course from Karl Popper, and I'll use this by way of an introduction. As philosopher, sociologist and anthropologist, Ernst Gellner was resolute in his defence of reason and objectivity as the path to truth. He perceived the infallibility of religious doctrine, or any doctrinal truth for that matter, and the relativism of postmodern thought as the enemies of the one true path to knowledge. Gellner developed his epistemology through an extended critique of Karl Popper, although it was also the case that his debt to Popper was never in question. Popper himself described relativism as a betrayal of reason and of humanity. Yet he also seems to have shared a core concern with at least some thinkers gathered into Gellner's umbrella term of postmodernism. In particular, I'm thinking of how Popper's thesis, as set out in The Open Society, resonates with Foucault's argument, derived from his reading of Kant, that we should engage in a permanent critique of ourselves, and that we should be suspicious of any totalizing ideas that promise a final emancipation. Of course, for Foucault, this would include the Enlightenment project, which underpins the rationalism of both Popper and Gellner, and this is where an imagined conversation between these thinkers would likely terminate. So despite the obvious disagreements that may have resulted, it is at least possible to imagine a fruitful dialogue between Popper and Foucault. Gellner, however, foreclosed on the possibility for such a dialogue, creating a categorical distinction between rationalism and a diverse research paradigm he characterized, or rather caricatured, as postmodernism. Gellner's debt to Popper and the normative project they shared, defining and defending the open society, although Gellner himself would prefer the term cumulative cognitive tradition, placed Gellner in an uneasy relationship with the object of his critique. Teasing out the Popperian moment in Gellner's writing and bringing this into a dialogue with Foucauldian-inspired research might help us to understand the relationship between modern and postmodern social thought today. So the problem I want to examine can be stated in the form of a question which conjoins Popper, Gellner and Foucault. And the question is this: what is the source of critique which is so essential to the open society? And just to preempt the analysis, which also discloses the rhetorical nature of my question, I will be suggesting that contingency is the source of critique, and contingency can be thought in different ways. So a few words on contingency. I'm suggesting that in the work of Gellner and Popper and in the work of Foucault, we can detect competing research paradigms. In the paper, I treat these thinkers as exemplary representatives, noting in advance that this entails glossing the internally heterogeneous nature of a paradigm. I'm working with the assumption that a paradigm is not constituted through consensus in the naive sense of that term, but through disagreements and petty disputes which are structured by a general level of agreement on what Kuhn called fundamentals. More on that shortly. First, I want to sketch an outline of the paradigms in question. On the one hand, we have what I'm calling a problem-solving approach, represented by Popper and Gellner. And on the other, we have a problem-driven approach, represented by Foucault. In the problem-solving approach, the conception of contingency employed is weak, while that of the problem-driven approach, the conception of contingency employed is strong. Now, this terminology lacks a certain precision, but it does allow me to discuss rationalism and postmodernism without having to continually specify terms such as historicism or holism. And these are common. This terminology is common to both paradigms. So beginning with the problem-solving approach, or problem-solving research, Popper acknowledged that to adopt the attitude of the critical rationalist was ultimately an act of faith. It was in fact an irrational decision. But once the decision is taken, then the scope of application extends to any and all problems that can be solved by an appeal to reason, which for Popper means clear thought and experience rather than emotions and passions. More specifically, and here I'm quoting Popper, to be rational is to adopt an attitude of readiness to critical arguments and to learn from experience. The rationalist is willing to admit that I may be wrong and you may be right, and by an effort we may get nearer to the truth. Moving beyond the subject-object worlds with three-world ontology, Popper accorded a crucial world to world three, which is to say the social world. Reason is the property of individuals only to the extent that they are part of a particular collectivity, a modern liberal culture. As individuals, we may on occasion argue with ourselves, but we have learned to do this only by arguing with others. Ultimately, it is the argument and not the person arguing that counts. Flawed though this is, and is likely to remain, as long as people are free to falsify each other's hypotheses and truth claims, then the open society is secure against ideological monopoly. This is Popper's basic position. And while staying true to the core Popperian principle of falsification, Gellner did dissent from what he saw as a naive faith in World 3 on the part of Popper. Gellner himself follows Descartes into the space of pure mind, which will be Popper's World 2, and emerges in the empiricism of Hume, which is Popper's World 1. From Descartes comes the technique of subjecting the arbitrary accretions of culture and experience to doubts, while from Hume comes the need for evidence, the stuff of falsification. Adding an empirically informed World 3 sociological dimension to this epistemology, Gellner arrives at his big ditch thesis, capital B, capital D. One tradition, with its origins in 17th century Europe, to quote, have completely transformed the condition of human life by engendering the scientific and industrial revolution. And this transformation is essentially an accident of history, what Gellner calls an earthly miracle. It was this miracle which gave birth to a style of thought capable of cumulative cognitive growth. So Gellner gives us a Weberian-inspired theory of modernity combined with Popperian-inspired scientific method. Truth is fundamentally distinct from the merely contingent, but it is nonetheless fallible. Indeed, its essential fragility, the elusiveness of a final guarantee, can only be offset by what Gellner calls the demonstration effect of technological achievement. I've suggested already that the nature of a paradigm is one of agreement, but not in the naive sense of consensus. And Gellner's critique of Popper is precisely the kind of petty dispute which plays an integrative role in the paradigm. Whether we stay with a World 3 rationalist like Popper and call the paradigm in question critical rationalism, or whether we go with Gellner and call it rational fundamentalism, we are not dealing with a dispute over Kuhnian fundamentals. The relation between reason and what Weber and Habermas call rationalization is one of difficult and indeterminate progress, and the danger of insurrection intrinsic to the latter, such as the Holocaust or environmental degradation, makes reason the proper authority. The benefits of the technologies born out of the earthly miracle must be weighed against their destructive potential, and a historically specific agent is responsible for striking the balance. In his book Conditions of Liberty, Gellner describes this agent as Modular Man, at once introspective and discursive, the subject of Gesellschaft rather than Gemeinschaft. Modular Man is, of course, modern rational man, individual, egalitarian, willing to stand against the coercive state, and capable of performing a dazzling range of tasks. Attending as far as is humanly possible only to the facts, the agent of reason clears away error so as to leave a solid kernel of truth. But this kernel of truth is never free from skepticism. It remains fallible and must be subjected to continuous and rigorous testing. In other words, truth is never more than provisional, hence contingent. This mode of contingence is weakly articulated, however, because it adopts a problem-solving approach to subjects, objects, and subject-subject relations. While non-teleological, the problem-solving approach is nonetheless an evolutionary theory of social chains, a process of social learning which takes the existing structure as given, or at least as the given framework for improvement. The aim is to solve problems and account for anomalies as they arise within the complex whole, attempting to smooth the overall functioning of something which is beyond the understanding of any single mind and should remain beyond the control of any single authority. So I want to contrast this with the problem-driven approach or problem-driven research. In contrast to the problem-solving approach, problem-driven research goes all the way down to what Foucault called an historical ontology of ourselves. This is not with a view to disclosing historical laws or predicting a future course of events, and this is Popper's understanding of historicism, but with a view to tracing out the fundamentally contingent nature of the present. In Foucault's work, for example, the Enlightenment is what he calls an event, and this gives rise to historically specific practical systems. As with Popper, thought is studied as a social practice, but departing from Popper, the way we think, the way we speak and act, the very subjectivity we embody is circumscribed by the event. As a rupture in the order of things, the event opens out the possibility for specific rationalities to be inscribed into social practices, and it is in this way that truth, or what Foucault calls truth, is constituted and consolidated. In the problem-driven approach, then, to quote Foucault, truth is a thing of this world, which is to say it is made by, rather than reflected in, our representational systems. Insofar as a society is ordered by discourses which distinguish true from false statements, and insofar as this empowers certain subject positions, institutional sites, technologies and so forth, then social order can be characterized as a regime of truth. A truth regime encompasses a number of domains: relations of control over things, relations of action upon the action of others, and relations with oneself. Here we see a degree of convergence with Popper's three-world ontology, but in Foucault's work, again, this is circumscribed by the event, so that the way we have come to think, to know, and to act lacks any original, teleological, or permanent fixity or essence. Foucault also theorizes the relation between subjectivity, objectivity, and intersubjectivity in terms of three axes: knowledge, power, and ethics. The intersection of these axes establishes what he calls a grid of possibilities and limitations regarding what can be said and what can be done, ways of knowing and ways of doing that circumscribe the parameters of the true. It is only through our subject positioning within this socially constructed grid that we can make true or false propositions. A truth regime, then, is implicated in the ordering of social space. Certain possibilities are included into the realm of the sayable and the doable, and other possibilities are excluded. In this way, the formation of truth is a mode of foreclosing, or a type of political decision which articulates power relations. The problem-driven approach aims to trace out the discursive formation of the particular modes of thought and action that we embody, the aim of which is to open out the possibility of deconstructing and reconstructing the present by disclosing its, which is to say, our fundamental contingency. So in both paradigms, the source of critique is immanent to the scope of its concerns. In the case of the problem-solving approach, those statements which attain the status of truth must be continually tested. True statements remain permanently falsifiable, and yet knowledge also builds on itself in a cumulative evolutionary manner. In other words, according to the problem-solving paradigm, we are moving steadily forward, more or less, with the scope of reason growing like a snowball. For the problem-driven analyst, the difference between social order and social dislocation hinges on a tenuous relation between the defense of the true and the manifest scope of a radical surplus, a surplus of meanings, a surplus of possibilities, which has been deferred or excluded. And this renders our mode of social organization both unstable and permanently exposed to the possibility of change. These research paradigms do not see eye to eye, and yet they do share an important normative concern, keeping the open society open. And in both cases, it is contingency which is the possibility for critique and the impossibility of a final truth, notwithstanding the fact that contingency is circumscribed in different ways. In the paper, I use an example to highlight what is at stake here, one well documented and long since discredited: eugenics. I'm assuming that we all have some knowledge of this topic, so I'll confine myself here simply to a few relevant points. Problem solvers such as Gellner and Popper recognize the insidious nature of practices such as eugenics, and this is why they abhor the idea of utopian engineering projects, whether they originate on the left or right of the political spectrum. However, they also fail to really engage with the liberal Enlightenment origins of such practices and the extent to which they are commensurate with the open society and the rule of reason. The discursive construction of novel problems, such as the dangerous individual, the moral lunatic, and the morally defective child, all produced in tandem with the birth of liberal democracy, brought scientific practice and state administration into a productive relation, culminating in pervasive discourses of hereditary degeneracy, mental deficiency, racial hygiene, and so forth. It was these concerns that would generate a range of eugenic engineering projects, and these were highly resistant to falsification. So here's the point. Eugenics cannot be explained by the ignorance of Popper's closed society, by the utopian blueprints of Hayek's collectivisms, or by the doctrines of a secular Hegelian priesthood, which is Gellner's particular bogey. In the case of the UK and the US, and both of these are contenders to the ideal of the open society, the practice emerged through manifold conflicts waged in the name of reason between psychologists and doctors and teachers, those who supported negative eugenics in the form of sterilization, and those who supported positive eugenics in the form of family welfare, between a patriarchal liberal state and the opportunities for social work opened out by educated women. It was these types of conflicts that generated the eugenics programs. So Gellner's Modular Man is not only the subject of knowledge, but also its object. As certain categories of person are defined as a problem, so they are subjected to an objectivizing gaze that derives its authority and its legitimacy from its claims to truth. And the crucial question seems to be this: is cognition ever fully independent of value-oriented practices, and should we accept it when it appears to be so? Is the Habermasian ideal of domination-free disco also, depending on the context of its articulation, a dangerous idealization? This is why the problem-driven approach is concerned with problematizing things, which is essentially a practice of de-reification. In the rest of the paper, I examine Gellner's encounter with postmodernism specifically, focusing on his book Postmodernism, Reason and Religion, published in 1992. Again, for the purposes of brevity, I'll confine myself here to sketching this part of the paper. In this little book, which I'm sure many, if not most of you have read, Gellner begins by noting the binary nature of human conflict, what he calls schismatic disagreements which have polarized mankind, Catholics against Protestants, reason against faith, liberal capitalism against state socialism. But, he says, things have changed, and the world is now structured by three fundamental and irreducible positions, I'm quoting there: religion, relativism, and reason. So the plot is one of three characters, but the opponents of reason in this little book are not treated equally. Gellner provides an account of Islamic fundamentalism within the context of modernity, which is consistent with his intellectual investment in this topic, as we saw from Michael Lesnoff's paper. His treatment of postmodernism, however, is essentially a demolition job, and it lacks any sense of impartiality. In fact, religion seems to play the role of an alibi in this book, a cover story for the main event, and as it turns out, there is a twist in the plot. Relativism and religion are not in fact separate problems, but part of the same problem. Gellner skillfully molds them into a single movable object, which we can interpret as anti-reason. For Gellner, postmodernism is the latest chapter in the story of idealism, which, insofar as this concerns social reality, ignores the constraints engendered by political and economic power, or what he calls objective structures with real independent existence. As far as I can tell, Gellner subscribes to a number of sociological axioms which are, strictly speaking, no longer axiomatic. First is the tendency to counter constructivism by opposing the realm of ideas and language to some kind of extra-linguistic, material domain or substrate. Second is an understanding of power as something constraining, coercive, or otherwise negative in its effects. And these are not unrelated concerns. In the paper I draw on the work of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe to argue that Gellner's critique is coloured by the way he thinks power and constraint. This sees him projecting the categories and their contents from his paradigm onto postmodern theory and analysis. The question of power has been discussed in Mark Hogarth's paper. As to the relation between the ideal, the real, and the material, there's simply not enough time to discuss this in a presentation, so I'll leave this for discussion if anybody's interested in it. Okay, moving on from this, Gellner also restricts his reading of postmodernism to a very limited number of texts. In the book in question, The Charge of Relativism relies almost solely on a single essay by Paul Rabinow, published in 1986. The title of this piece, Representations of Social Facts, provides a clue as to why this particular contribution was selected from an edited collection, although Gellner seems to have interpreted it rather too literally. In this piece, Rabinow argues that if Foucauldian analytics avoids the problem of totally relativizing reason, or of turning different conceptions of truth and falsity into a question of subjectivism. He adds to this that historically circumscribed styles of reasoning determine specific criteria of objectivity, which is to say they establish definite possibilities and impossibilities regarding what can count as a truth statement. Now, Gellner's concerns are all anticipated here in Rabinow's paper, but we hear very little about the mechanics of this in Gellner's account, beyond a few quotes from Rorty, that is, with whom Rabinow does not entirely agree with, in fact. So what's wrong here beyond the failure to report faithfully on the text in question? Well, as I've suggested, problem-driven research is concerned with the ontological problematic, the discursive construction of social knowledge, subjectivities, and social practices. To interpret this, as Gellner does, as a hermeneutic retreat into epistemic relativism is really to miss the point. Now, many people are unconvinced by the Foucauldian approach, but the careful crafting of Gellner's argument suggests that he was never open to the possibility of being convinced or falsified in the first place. Gellner has already made up his mind, and there seems to be a strategic purpose to his account. He is in fact defending his paradigm. This becomes more explicit as his three fundamental and irreducible positions become two oppositional identities. Gellner identifies Marxism as one of the intellectual ancestors of postmodernism. While at first Marxism may seem like an unlikely candidate, it does after all claim to be scientific, concerned with objective truth, and with the realm of ideas or meanings merely epiphenomenal to the material substrate. Yet in Gellner contends that all of this was simply part of the original Marxist revelation, subsequently abandoned. In the original Marxism, truth was the possession of a secular priesthood, and this insulated it against the critical standards of the open society and provision for its transformation into what Gellner calls a subjectivist doctrine. And this move was completed, according to Gellner, by the Frankfurt School. In Gellner's account, the Frankfurters detached themselves from factual constraints, moving solely into normative prescriptions, or as Gellner himself puts it, they began to indulge themselves in private revelations. Moving in the groove of the Frankfurters, postmodernism has simply transformed the style of thought into a movement. So the Frankfurt School provides a hinge that articulates both religion, which is to say absolutism, and relativism. Standing back from the specifics of his analysis so as to consider the overall argument, then it becomes clear that Gellner has constructed two levels of signification. On one level, religion and relativism begin to supplement each other. An example, I think, of metonymy. Just as the phrase on the couch can stand in for psychoanalysis, so religion and relativism can each be used to signify the other. At level 2, the entire ensemble is condensed as a unified sign which derives its significance solely from reason. As the absolute negative of reason, the religion-relativism complex is given a singular identity, anti-reason. The question we might ask ourselves is whether or not this matters. I think it does matter. While starting out with what he calls three primary colours, Gellner creates a polarised opposition between exactly two identities, or two possibilities. The meaning and significance of both are created from within the game of truth production itself. In this rendering of postmodernism, we lose sight of its internal complexity, of the fact that this envelope contains a plurality of positions and possibilities for articulating the meaning of world, subjectivity, and intersubjectivity. So the irrational foundation of rationalism, that leap from faith which Popper acknowledges, is not without its political consequences. A few words in conclusion. In his sociology of reason, Gellner followed Weber in explaining that the rationalization of science, industry, and statecraft has engendered a civilization which has learned how to exploit what Gellner calls the orderly predictability of the world. We have, and increasingly so I think, become aware of the ambivalence of this civilization. Orderly predictability is not simply there in nature to be found and exploited in the name of human progress. Orderly predictability is also made, and this is the moment when bodies and minds become the raw material of scientific, industrial, and administrative technologies. And this is also done in the name of human progress. Some rationalists maintain that the scientific attitude can deliver a way of knowing and doing which is value neutral. Others, and I think Gellner can be located here in the second camp, accept the impossibility of this ideal, but still insist that it can and ultimately should deliver a form of social organization which is truly progressive in the sense of emptying the world of force and coercion. I wouldn't deny the noble aspiration here, but we should not be blinded by ideals. It might be worth drawing a lesson from contemporary debates in democratic theory, with at least some contributors arguing that the open society requires a healthy dose of contestation. There is no need to lament the lack of consensus between the problem solvers and the problematizers. That is, we will hardly see an alliance between them. More promising is what follows from the coexistence of these paradigms, both of which, it should be said, emerge from and identify with, albeit in different ways, Enlightenment modernity. Taken together, the moderns and the postmoderns articulate a double movement from truth formation to its deconstruction. And this helps to prevent ideological closure without abandoning altogether the goal of an emancipatory social order. It helps to ensure, but not in the sense of a final guarantee, that we continue to engage in a permanent critique of ourselves. Thank you.